Welcome, everyone. I'm Christine Chen. This is Esalen Live, where we chat with change agents, swim deep waters, and explore transformation and potential. I'm so excited today for today's topic, which is parenting in a pandemic. Joining us is one of the most respected experts in her field, Dr. Archana Basu, a research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking.
Yeah, we know you're so busy, but I want to let some people understand your background here. You're a psychologist at Massachusetts General at Harvard Medical School, and you specialize in working with children and parents coping with trauma, stress, and bereavement. And currently, there is research underway, and I'm guessing like pretty intense right now, in supporting children and parents during this pandemic. What can you share with us? I mean, we're just learning so much right now.
Yeah, I think that, there's certainly lessons from, prior research and past experiences that we can draw on. But I do want to start off by acknowledging, something that's been said, but I think is, can't be repeated enough, which is that even as we have a lot of, prior research, we are in a particularly unique situation right now because this pandemic is a mass sort of disaster of global proportions. It is generation defining, one might say. And there's really, globally speaking, there isn't a part of the world that's been untouched. And so I think, we can all relate to this, with our friends or family that we have in other countries. We're all going through this in some shape or form together. And I think that's unique because prior research on mass disasters has focused on, say, natural disasters that tend to be localized. So I think the pervasiveness of this is different. And I also think the fact that it's still ongoing and there isn't a clear horizon, that makes it pretty different. And so in some ways, I think there are lessons we can bring forward, both in terms of, the types of mental health impact and distress that we typically see after a severe stress or traumatic experience. But also, important lessons in what helps with coping and resilience. But I do think that this is pretty unique in terms of the implications for ongoing long-term stress, especially for parents, which is what we're talking about today.
Right. Let me ask you though, the latest data, and I actually learned this from one of your colleagues, shows that a whole generation of parents who are trying to work through this pandemic, manage kids at home, work from home, distance learning are the most stressed and the most tired, fatigued by the pandemic if they're well and healthy, if they're lucky enough to be well and healthy and not affected by the disease itself, that the stress itself on the side of just all of this, multiple generations at home. What can you share with us in terms of what you've discovered in the research?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the ongoing nature of this certainly speaks to high levels of burnout that we're hearing about. The research certainly shows that there's been a couple different sort of population-based studies in the US. And research does show that, parents, particularly with younger kids, are particularly affected by this. And I suspect that is in large part because the sort of demands on parents in terms of, as you said, working from home, but also the level of, attention that young kids need is pretty significant. With older kids, they can be a little bit more independent. I think they still need a lot of attention and support, especially if they're remote schooling. And then, as you said, that is if we are lucky to be in good health. We still have stable jobs because, of course, there's the disease aspect of the pandemic, but there's also the economic recession, which has affected many, many parents. One of the studies that was recently published found that about 27% of parents are reporting worsening mental health for themselves. And this is really important because actually, we children rely on parents to help them sort of cope. Parents help buffer the impact of such, stressful situations and experiences on kids. So the fact that parents' own emotional and just energy levels are so strained, and they are struggling themselves with a lot of mental health concerns, is pretty remarkable and concerning.
Is
Um,
there a potential to mediate the situation at all? I mean, we always talk about reach out to experts and learn what you can to help your family, but the idea of just making it better at home, what is the potential to change something at home or enact kinds of habits or structures that help maybe buffer this when mental health is at a challenge for many adults?
I think that's that is probably the most important question in front of us, right? And the first thing I like to, I think about, and I like to remind myself, as a parent, and I sort of talk to, families that I work with, is that, you can't pour from an empty cup. And so this is, as parents, we are much more likely to be attentive to our kids' needs and cater to them, which is, of course, makes total sense. But I would say the number one thing for parents, or really any caregivers that are consistently caring for kids, is to be really intentional about their own self-care, right?
Mm.
And just the idea of nourishing themselves allows them to nourish and be available to their children. I think, you alluded to a couple different things. You talked about sort of, routines and structures. And I think that is definitely something that is very helpful, is having some sort of balance between being flexible, because there's a lot of ongoing change. Right now, for example, kids are heading back to school. And yes, we're heading back to school and we know the teachers and our friends, but it's definitely not the same experience. And so, having some balance of flexibility and routines is very, very helpful. And I guess, there's lots and lots of resources online, but the main thing that I take away from many of these resources is the idea of sort of being very mindful and intentional, and really sort of building in the emotional refueling, whether it's being intentional about sleep or nutrition or exercise or socialization, making sure that we pick something on a daily basis that allows us to stay in what has clearly become an emotional ultramarathon.
Ultra marathon, you said it. That is pretty much it. Distance learning has been so challenging for so many families, and it's prolonged. Like you said, the end is not near. We don't have a really clear solution. What is the impact for a kid's on the kid's potential to grow and learn in this environment? I know that kids are so different, but can you shed some light on this topic?
Um, I think what it looks like for each child is going to be very different. So I'll start with broad strokes to say, we've often talked about this as homeschooling, but the reality is this has really been like crisis schooling at home, right? So we are home, but we are still in the midst of the pandemic. We are worried as families and, as human beings, about risk of exposure, worries about maybe, job security. There's a range of things. Families have been affected by the loss of loved ones. So there are layers upon layers of concerns. And so basically, it's not just that we're home and doing remote learning. I guess that's the number one thing I would say. We also know that when we are coping just at a basic neurobiological level and adapting to stress and potentially threatening situations, and we are worried, the kind of response that we have during stressful situations, that can actually interfere in some active learning environments. So often our limbic system is sort of activated. That can actually interfere with the types of school-based learning that we typically think about. I mean, children learn best when they feel safe and connected, right?
Mm.
If your
So
sense of
to that
safety is threatened, yeah.
Yeah, so sense of safety is threatened. So in some ways, my question then here is, can some kids, because kids are all different, can they reach fuller potential because the social situation of school has been not great for some in the past, that maybe this could be a better situation? Is there something to that in the research that you've been doing?
I can tell you that clinically speaking and working with families, I do think that there is a subset of children for whom, say, for example, if they've been struggling with anxiety, in school settings, um, being able to sort of minimize the stress that comes from being in there can be, this has actually been sort of helpful for them. So I do think that there are children and families for whom the ability to adapt to studying and working from home has actually worked out pretty well. So I think to your point that, there may be some children who are coping better in this more contained environment, I think is certainly true for some of the families.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What can parents do to continue to foster potential in their kids? Again, acknowledging that every situation is different, but are there some ideas that we can start to filter in into this environment more in the future, the longer this goes on?
Um, you know, I think one of the things is to hold in our minds that there are a lot of firsts that we are still going through. So what I mean by that is, we're heading back to school, but it's still sort of the first time the context has changed and school doesn't feel the same. I'm starting to hear from families who are, planning for the holiday season, for example, what will Halloween and Thanksgiving and, this sort of December holiday season bring for us. And throughout it all, I think, in all of the conversations that I have, there is always a really impressive level of sort of our capacity to adapt and be creative that is highlighted. And I think, what I take away from it is that, yes, there is a sense of loss and grief. Losses are both big and small. And there's a lot of, at times, gratitude for what we do have and the capacity to cope with it. And so, as a community and as families, I think both the ability to hold the grief as well as the sense of gratitude and growth are all important.
Mm.
I think acknowledging the losses, but also our capacity to change and cope are both important. So there are many ways in which I know that there are mental health resources and very creative solutions that are available online. But I think for me, those are the two main elements that sort of, underlie a lot of the ideas that I've heard about.
Question about the potential for working parents. Do careers suffer? There's been so much said about whether work from home is stifling for potential or actually supporting people. What do you think? What are you finding in your family research?
My research doesn't particularly focus on this element, but I will say one thing that, and I'm sure, many of us have read about this because it's been in the news a lot, is that the impact of the recession has been disproportionate on certain, communities and certain subgroups. And one of the emerging lines of research from Northwestern University has been that the economic recession has disproportionately affected women who are working, many of whom are parents themselves. And one of the reasons is often that women may be in caregiving roles. And because children are not in school and there's been a loss of that access to other types of childcare, they may be needing to stay home and opt out of work situations. And so I think that, as you said, will there be an impact on, careers? I think emerging data is showing that absolutely there is.
How are you navigating in your own life, if you don't mind sharing? Because I think, one thing we like to do in terms of us reaching our potential is really learn from people who are experts in their field. Can you give us some insight into your life and how you are navigating?
I'm happy to talk about it. I will just say that I think there are good days and bad days and struggles, much like I think any other person. And, you know, I have to consciously, again, going back to that idea of, being mindful and intentional, I actually have to remind myself to be just as intentional about being able to sort of have a plan and, that I talk with my partner about, to be able to get through this on a day-to-day basis. And the horizon for us really is sometimes, day to day, and sometimes it's week to week, and always building in that space to be able to plan. I will say there's sort of three things that I try to keep in mind. One is what I talked about earlier, which was, practices that help us to emotionally refuel, whether it's sleep, exercise, socialization, those elements, like building that in really consciously. The second thing I would say is communication. And this is communication within the family or communication with the school district. I think this is incredibly key, like figuring out maybe a family check-in time. If your kids are older than, all of you together, or checking in certainly with your partner or co-caregivers to have a plan to see. And the third thing is, expect the unexpected. We just don't know how this is going to plan out. We know that we have opted. So for example, many parents have opted for, let's say, remote schooling or an hybrid option. And, they might try it out. They might talk about it. I would highly encourage families to sort of have an open dialogue within their family with their kids about the rationale for what choices they're making as a family, because kids are experiencing this. They have questions, they have concerns, and family check-ins allow us to talk about it. And then to know that you're going to try it out and will probably have to adapt it. So I think those are some of the three things that I try to focus on.
Those are really very informative practices. And at Esalen, we hold up so high the idea of potential, and we're big into ritual.
Yeah.
The rituals are so much a part of our lives. And I know that you are a longtime yogi. How has your yoga practice affected the way that you're managing, or perhaps approach some of the research and the questions that you ask about this time?
I think, so I guess I'll say two main things about that. The first is, I'm going to start out by normalizing the idea that consistency with any practice, any ritual, as you highlighted, including yoga or meditation, for me, is key. And I have struggled with it. There have been periods of time that I haven't been able to keep up. And I think one of the biggest learning lessons for us on all of this is compassion, including to ourselves and to others, and not be judgmental. This is really, really trying and unusual. So that's number one, I will say. The second thing I will just say is, for me, there is the mindfulness component to it, which is actually not very different from a lot of the mindfulness-based coping strategies that you hear about, in sort of popular media, even in research. There's a lot of evidence-based for mindfulness-based coping strategies. And so I think the yoga practice and meditation guide and support that and strengthen that. And the last element for me personally is sort of a spiritual element to it. This pandemic is coming, it's the viral pandemic, but there's also the pandemic of disparities. We know some communities have been disproportionately affected, and it does provide us with an opportunity to pause and really think carefully about what type of future we want to build together. The goal for me personally is not to go back to where we were. I do think the virus has sort of illuminated and magnified for us, illuminated for us and sort of magnified the disparities, and really thinking about what is the way forward as individuals, as communities, that takes into account these pre-existing disparities that we know about.
What is the potential then for this pandemic to reshape the way a family functions moving forward into the future? I mean, obviously, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what does your wisdom and research tell you about that?
I'll just say that, the two areas that I think about a lot, one is sort of I'm part of a healthcare system, and, how can we as a healthcare system, as mental health providers, be responsive to the needs of the families and communities we serve? And so I think that's one element of it. The other element of it is, public policy. And I'll just say I'm not a policy person, but there is a tremendous amount of research, including at the Centers for Disease Control website, that talks about how to mitigate or prevent adversities for children. And one of those, lines of thinking suggests that family-centered policies, right, including economic policies, are actually really important in thinking about supporting children and families. Supporting kids really means supporting families and parents and schools, right? It's the communities in which children live, grow, and develop. So for me, it's about, family-centered policies and family-centered sort of care that acknowledges this sort of communal trauma, but also acknowledges the strengths that we bring, and thinks about how this is unique or different for people coming from different, sort of backgrounds and communities. Our sense of loss, not just in this pandemic, but really our sense of kind of loss as communities that some communities have experienced over many generations, Black and Indigenous communities in this country. It's layers upon layers of loss, right? There is a sense of anger, of betrayal, and I think responsive care has to have a space for all of that.
It's a lot right now, as we've been saying. Is there anything in the middle of all of this that still brings you a sense of wonder and awe? I'm kind of thinking about what you just said about compassion. Have you noticed that people's compassion has risen up to a higher level, or is there something else where you're just like, wow, that's amazing right now? Because I think these moments are also so important to note while we're going through all of this collectively. Yes?
I think you're absolutely right. With every adversity and, sort of as this wears on, there's so much unexpected that happens. And I am just continually impressed by people's capacity and creativity in coming together, as families, also as communities. Like, there's been so many wonderful examples of, neighbors taking care of each other and looking out for each other. Whether it's making masks, whether it's painting stones and leaving words of affirmation, just finding ways to cheer each other on and figuring out a way together. I mean, actually, if you think about it, all the public health interventions, certainly most of them, require a sense of sort of a communal understanding, right? We do the distancing or wear masks, not just for ourselves, but to protect everyone around us. So I absolutely have to agree with you. It is heartwarming to see the positivity and response and coping that we see. And I do think that it is continually impressive.
Well, I hope that we continue to be impressive and compassionate and do all the things that we can to support each other. Thank you for sharing this amazing information from cutting edge research going on right now during this pandemic, and just hopefully we can just keep supporting each other the best way we know how. Thank you so much, Dr. Archana Basu from Harvard's School of Public Health. You've been great, and thank you so much. I know you're busy. Sharing the time is wonderful.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Have a beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too.